Margaret Harper never dreamed that turning 68 would feel like a funeral. Not of a person, but of a relationship, a quiet, painful burial of everything she had poured into motherhood, into the life of her only child, Vanessa. The day had begun with hope, as most of her days still stubbornly did. She woke early, brushing the slight stiffness in her knees aside, and ran a hand through her silver gray hair before sitting at the edge of the bed in her small but meticulously kept guest house, the very one in the backyard of her daughter's sprawling suburban home. The soft chime of her phone had pinged with a reminder. Dinner at 6 p.m., Le Bateau Blanc. It was the fanciest place she had ever been invited to for a birthday meal. A French fusion restaurant with prices that made her uncomfortable to even glance at. Vanessa had made the reservation herself a week prior, mentioning it as casually as one might mention picking up milk. "You should wear something nice," her daughter had said distractedly, while swiping through something on her phone. Margaret had smiled politely and nodded, though the words had stung just a bit, like they always did. Something nice, as if she usually dressed in rags. She supposed that was how Vanessa saw her, now an old woman in sweaters and sensible shoes, invisible and slow, tucked away behind the house like a piece of furniture you no longer needed but didn't have the heart to throw away. Still, it was her birthday, and that small invitation felt like a miracle, a rare breadcrumb of warmth from a daughter who had long since grown cold. Margaret spent the day preparing for it as if she were going to a royal ball. She steamed her best dress, a deep emerald green wrap she'd bought months ago on clearance and never worn. She polished her small pearl earrings, touched up her nails with a faint blush pink, and took her time curling the soft strands of her shoulder-length hair. It wasn't vanity, to a self-respect. She didn't want to look like the tired woman. She felt like most days. She wanted to look like the woman she once was, the one who had raised a daughter alone after her husband's heart attack at 47, who had run a local bookstore and single-handedly kept them afloat, who had sacrificed spa days, travel dreams, and peace of mind so Vanessa could have piano lessons, braces, and every advantage possible. And as she stood in the mirror before leaving, she thought maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. The restaurant was already busy when she arrived. Everything smelled of butter and wine and softly spoken secrets. A young hostess with slick-back hair and a headset greeted her politely, asking for the reservation name. "Vanessa Carter," Margaret said softly, her voice still full of old-school grace. And the hostess smiled before gesturing toward a candlelit table near the back. Margaret's heart fluttered. It was a lovely spot, private, elegant, and for a moment she felt a whisper of pride. Perhaps Vanessa had remembered that she didn't like noise. Perhaps she had planned this with care. But that hope began to wither the moment she saw her daughter already seated, sipping white wine, her eyes glued to her phone, her husband Jacob beside her, fiddling with his smartwatch. No one stood. No one smiled. "Hi, Mom," Vanessa said, without looking up. Jacob nodded but didn't say anything at all. There was no happy birthday, no flowers, no hug. No Lily, her precious granddaughter, whom she hadn't seen in 2 weeks because, as Vanessa had put it, "She's just too busy with exams, Mom." Margaret sat down slowly, placing her small gift bag on the Taibla hardcover journal and a charm bracelet for Lily. She tried to smile. "This place is lovely," she said gently. "Very fancy. I feel underdressed." Vanessa gave a quick glance and offered a flat "You look fine," before returning to whatever it was on her screen. The waiter arrived and took orders quickly. Margaret asked for trout almondine and a single glass of water. Vanessa ordered steak. Jacob ordered duck. And then the silence began, the kind that was not empty, but thick with unspoken things. Margaret tried to make small talk, asking about Lily's school play, about Jacob's recent promotion, even about Vanessa's boutique. But every question was met with clipped responses or distracted nods. Her daughter's eyes rarely met hers. Halfway through the meal, just as the plates were set before them, Vanessa sighed loudly and finally put her phone down. "Mom, we need to talk," she said abruptly, leaning in, her voice low but firm. Margaret's heart sank. She set her fork down, folding her hands gently in her lap like she used to do in church. "Of course, darling," she said. Vanessa's eyes were sharp, too sharp. There was no warmth, no hesitation. "It's time you moved out of the guest house," she said. The words hit like glass shattering in Margaret's mind. "What?" she whispered, the confusion genuine. "Why?" Vanessa shrugged. "Because it's time. You've been there almost 6 years. You're not contributing anymore. We need the space. We're thinking of turning it into an office/gym." She laughed slightly, as if trying to make it sound like a light decision. But the undercurrent was brutal. Margaret blinked, her face carefully composed. I thought it was all right. I help with Lily and I cook sometimes." "Yes, you did," Vanessa interrupted, cutting her off. "But Lily's older now, and honestly, you just hang around. Jacob and I have been talking, and we just think it's not sustainable anymore. Emotionally or financially. Emotionally, financially. As if she were a subscription service they no longer had use for." Margaret's stomach tightened, but still she nodded slowly, trying to keep her voice even. "See," she murmured. "And when were you planning to tell me?" Vanessa didn't flinch. "I just did. We'll give you some time to sort things out. Maybe look into some assisted living options. There's a nice place near the mall." Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but not from anger, from humiliation. She looked around the table. Jacob's eyes were on his phone again, and the waiter was pretending not to notice the tension. The music played softly overhead, romantic and ironic. "I'm sorry if I've been a burden," Margaret said quietly, finally putting the pain into words. That was when Vanessa, with a dramatic sigh and an eye roll, delivered the final blow. "Mom," she said, exasperated, "you are a burden. I mean, come on. We've done enough. We've let you live there for free. We included you in everything." "But this isn't the 1950s. Parents don't just move in forever." "You're not entitled to our lives." There it was. A sentence that sliced Margaret's heart into pieces too fine to pick up. "You're just a burden." The phrase echoed in her ears like a hymn turned to ash. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't plead. Yeah, she didn't even finish her water. With quiet, terrifying dignity, she picked up the gift bag for Lily, stood from the table. I placed it gently beside Vanessa's wineglass. "Give this to Lily for me," she said softly. "Tell her I love her." Vanessa looked confused. "Wait, aren't you going to eat?" But Margaret was already turning. Her heels clicked gently against the tile as she walked out, past tables full of laughter and clinking glasses. Out into the night, where the wind was cool and merciful. She didn't take a cab. She walked the full 20 minutes home alone, hugging her cardigan close to her chest like a fragile shield. She didn't cry until she got inside the guest house and closed the door. And even then, the tears came not with wails or moans, but in a dignified silence that soaked her pillow and clung to her like perfume. But the thing no one at that table knew, especially Vanessa, was that Margaret was not the helpless, forgotten woman they believed her to be. Underneath that quiet grace was steel. Over the years, while Vanessa spent her time curating her online image and running a boutique that was secretly propped up by Margaret's anonymous investments, Margaret had been handling her own portfolio. She still had the bookstore building rented to a local chain for a handsome monthly income. She had a trust set up after her husband's death, dividends from stock investments she never spoke about. And yes, the main house and guest house had been quietly deeded to her through a holding company created by her husband before he died. Vanessa had assumed the house was hers simply because Margaret never corrected her, and why would she? She had hoped they'd always live in harmony. That kindness and quiet giving would be returned in love. But now, after being called a burden, on her birthday, Margaret realized something simple and painful. Silence had bought her nothing. Love, when taken for granted, turns into leverage. And Margaret Harper had just decided it was time to stop being leveraged. Margaret closed the guest house door behind her like she was sealing a tomb. The silence inside wasn't comforting tonight. It was too sharp, too aware. It wrapped around her like a cold sheet of paper, sterile and unforgiving. She peeled off her cardigan with trembling hands and laid it neatly across the arm of her favorite chair. Her mind was still echoing from Vanessa's voice. That venom-laced sentence she'd spoken as casually as ordering dessert. "You're just a burden." It replayed over and over, each time cutting a little deeper. She stood in the middle of the room, her eyes landing on the framed photo atop the mantel. Vanessa at age 5. Sitting on Margaret's shoulders, her cheeks sticky with melted ice cream, her smile wide with trust and love. Margaret remembered that day like it was yesterday. It had taken every dollar she had at the time to take Vanessa to the seaside for her birthday. She'd packed peanut butter sandwiches and reused last year's beach towels. And yet Vanessa had squealed with joy the entire time, hugging her mother with sandy hands and salty hair. That child, where had she gone? When had she transformed into someone cold, transactional, and blind to everything Margaret had sacrificed for her? But standing there, Margaret wasn't interested in mourning anymore. Not tonight. Tonight, something shifted inside her, not anger, but resolve. Calm, cold, deliberate resolve. She turned to her bookshelf, reaching behind a row of faux classics until her fingers touched the old brass handle of the built-in wall safe. She twisted the dial with practiced fingers, and the door creaked open, revealing a tidy stack of folders, keys, a few bundles of cash, and a burgundy leather-bound planner with her initials embossed in gold. M.E.H. Margaret Elizabeth Harper. She pulled it all out and sat at her small mahogany desk, flipping open the first folder, a title deed dated back 17 years. Listing her late husband as sole owner of both the main house and the guest house, with a clause transferring ownership to Margaret upon his death. Vanessa had never asked to see it. Why would she? In her mind, the house was simply hers now, by virtue of entitlement and time. Margaret had never corrected the assumption. She'd wanted peace. She'd wanted a family. And above all, she'd wanted to stay close to Lily, her granddaughter, the only light left in that house. But love without respect, she now understood, becomes bondage. And she had no intention of living the rest of her life shackled to the whims of a woman who saw her only as a liability. She sifted through the documents with focused clarity: old trust account details, updated property tax receipts, legal correspondence with the family attorney, Benjamin Kessler, a man who had loyally handled the family's affairs since before Vanessa was even born. Margaret hadn't contacted him in over a year, not since the last update to her living will. But tonight she picked up the phone and dialed his direct number from memory. He answered on the third ring with a warm but surprised tone. "Margaret, it's been too long." She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Ben, I need to make some changes. And I need it all done quietly." For the next hour, Margaret moved, with the precision of a general laying out a counterattack. She instructed Benjamin to update her will immediately, removing Vanessa as a primary beneficiary and replacing her with Lily under a conditional trust only accessible when Lily turned 21, and only if she had completed an accredited college degree or vocational training. Margaret didn't want her sweet, soft-hearted granddaughter to be corrupted by sudden wealth. She wanted her to have the kind of backbone Vanessa clearly lacked. Next, she authorized the transfer of her liquid assets from the current investment firm to a new institution, one with tighter access controls and no shared account visibility. Benjamin offered gentle questions here and there, perhaps trying to gauge whether she was acting from pain or wisdom, but she answered each one with clarity and calm. "I gave them love," she said once, her voice flat, "and they weaponized it." She hung up just before midnight, the silence now transformed from cruel to strategic. There was power in silence, Margaret realized. It wasn't a weakness. It was preparation. The next morning, the sun rose over the Harper estate as if nothing had changed. Birds chirped, the lawn sprinklers came on, and Vanessa marched out to her SUV in heels and a silk blouse, waving off her husband's complaints about his protein shake. Margaret watched from the kitchen window with her tea in hand, her expression unreadable. She didn't come out to greet them like she usually did. Didn't offer to water the plants or walk Lily to the bus stop. She just sat, sipping, calculating. After they'd driven off, she made her second call to Andrea Lee, her old friend and financial planner, whom she hadn't needed much over the past decade. Andrea answered with cheerful surprise, and after catching up briefly, Margaret said, in a quiet voice, "Andrea, I'd like to pull the boutique investment." Andrea hesitated. Vanessa's boutique? Yes, Margaret replied. All of it. And I'd like a report of the past 5 years. I want to know how much of that business has been floating on my money. The numbers that came back too. Hours later, nearly knocked her breath away. Over 70% of the boutique's growth had been directly sustained by Margaret's investments. Without them, the store's cash flow would have failed within the first 18 months. Margaret closed the file and smiled. Interesting, she murmured. Very interesting. By noon, she made her third move, reaching out to Alan Marks, the broker who had handled the rental of her bookstore building in town. It had been converted into a co-op workspace in recent years, and Alan had always been good about keeping the income flowing. "Alan," she said briskly, "how much would the Harper house rent for in today's market?" "The whole property." Alan whistled low through the phone. "Prime neighborhood, 3-bedroom house plus a guest house. Lease $7,000 a month, maybe more." Margaret's smile deepened. "Good. I want a valuation." Quietly, and line up a rental agency. Hypothetically, if it went on the market next month, I want it filled. Alan didn't ask for reasons. Margaret Harper's voice didn't invite questions. She spent the rest of the afternoon organizing her papers, putting post-it notes on documents, copying keys, updating passwords, and preparing for the quiet storm she was about to unleash. Every act was a balm against the bruise her daughter had left on her heart. She paused only once when she found the birthday card she'd bought for herself months ago. It was silly and floral, with a glittery teacup on the front. She had planned to give it to Vanessa for Lily to sign, just in case they forgot. They always forget. Margaret picked it up and read the inside again. "To the best mom and grandma in the world, thank you for everything. We love you so much." She had signed Lily's name herself in her careful cursive. The ink had smudged a little from her tears that day. Now she dropped it into the trash without a second glance. When evening came and the house filled again with voices and clatter, Margaret didn't go out. She didn't warm dinner for them. She didn't wave through the window. She'd sat in the quiet with her notebook, drafting a letter addressed to Vanessa. Not a letter of confrontation or apology, but one of closure. It read simply, "Vanessa, you said I'm a burden. You're right, I have been, but not in the way you think. I've burdened you with the illusion that I needed you. I've protected you from understanding what it costs to bite the hand that feeds you, all in the name of love. But I won't do that anymore. You'll receive formal documents soon. Until then, consider this my final act of silence. Not out of weakness, but respect for myself." Mom, she placed the note into an envelope and sealed it. No return address, no signature. Just the clean truth. And then, as the lights flickered on across the yard and laughter echoed faintly through her open window, Margaret Harper stood with the poise of a woman who had finally decided to rise not with drama, but with dignity. She wasn't just an old woman in a guest house anymore. She was a silent storm preparing to sweep everything clean. And for the first time in years, she felt like she could finally breathe. The sun rose the next day with an almost poetic clarity. The sky brushed in gold as if the universe itself was honoring the dawn of a reckoning. Margaret stood by the window of her guest house, sipping her tea as the lights slanted across the lawn. She once tended herself. There was no hesitation left in her bones now. No quivering uncertainty or wistful longing for how things used to be. The woman who had silently endured years of neglect and quiet dismissal had vanished overnight. In her place stood someone unshakable, composed, and most importantly done. She dressed in a tailored navy suit, one she hadn't worn in years, the blazer hugging her shoulders like a piece of armor. Her hair was pinned with intention. Her pearl earrings gleamed against her soft, lined skin, and her sensible heels clicked against the floor with each step like punctuation marks of purpose. At precisely 9 o'clock, her lawyer's courier arrived with the first set of documents, the formal removal of Vanessa Carter from all estate-related assets, including the trust fund that Margaret's late husband had once intended for future generations, not to be squandered by a woman who treated her mother like a utility bill. Margaret signed each page with smooth precision, her hand never trembling, her eyes steady. It was not an act of revenge, was a recalibration of justice. The restoring of a balance that had been tipping in the wrong direction for far too long. By midday, Vanessa was sitting on the back patio, sipping her overpriced oat milk latte, and scrolling through social media when the second courier arrived, a uniformed woman with a neutral expression, holding a thick envelope. "Are you Vanessa Carter?" the woman asked. "Yes," Vanessa replied, confused. "You've been served," the courier said, placing the envelope gently on the patio table before turning and walking off without another word. Vanessa opened it casually at first, expecting some community notice or property tax bill. But as her eyes scanned the first page, her expression shifted from idle curiosity to mounting horror. It was a formal notice of termination. Her residency at the Harper property was ending within 30 days, and the land, including both main and guest houses, had been legally re-registered to a private holding company, owned and controlled solely by Margaret Harper. Alongside it was a cease and desist letter stating that any attempt to claim ownership, to alter the property, or resist the order would result in legal action and immediate eviction. She dropped the papers, breath caught in her throat, and ran barefoot inside, shouting for Jacob. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, thrusting the documents in his face. He stared at them, then at her, unblinking. "She owned the house," said, his voice flat. "You said it was yours," Vanessa snapped. "She never said otherwise." "I thought." But she didn't finish the sentence. Because deep down, she hadn't thought. She had assumed. Assumed her mother was too frail, too meek, too grateful to ever reclaim what was hers. And now, the floor beneath their lives was vanishing faster than they could scramble. That same afternoon, Margaret visited her bank, escorted into a private room where her financial manager handed her a stack of closure confirmations. The accounts tied to Vanessa's boutique had been drained and redirected into a new trust under Lily's name, safeguarded by layers of legal conditions that ensured Vanessa would never touch a cent. Margaret also revoked her co-signature from the boutique's commercial lease and dissolved her silent investment portfolio, one that had kept the business afloat without Vanessa even realizing it. She was precise and unflinching. When the manager asked if she wanted to notify the beneficiaries, Margaret gave a small, serene smile and replied, "No, let the silence inform them." Meanwhile, at the boutique, the store manager, a bright, loyal young woman named Yasmin, received her own envelope, this one with an updated ownership transfer notice. Vanessa had always treated Yasmin like a glorified assistant, never realizing that Margaret had quietly been grooming her to take over should the time come. And the time had, indeed, come. Yasmin read the letter with wide eyes, then folded it carefully and looked up, already picturing what she could do with the place now that it no longer dangled on Vanessa's strings. That evening, as Vanessa paced through her kitchen on the phone with every lawyer she knew, Jacob sat in the living room, staring blankly at the wall, his face pale. "Our cards just stopped working," he muttered, holding up his phone. "Credits tanked. They're freezing accounts." Vanessa waved him off. "It's a glitch. We'll fix it." But deep inside, panic was blooming like rot. She hadn't worked a real job in years. The boutique was her identity, but also a front and expensive, curated illusion of independence made possible by a mother she had grown to resent and devalue. And now, with Margaret's quiet departure from the shadows, everything was unraveling. The following morning brought more consequences. Jacob's business loan, which Margaret had co-signed in the early stages to help them qualify for financing, was now under review. Without her signature and with their credit dropping, the bank flagged the account for default. Jacob exploded. "She was the only reason we had that loan in the first place," he barked. "What the hell did you do?" Vanessa stared at him like a cornered animal. "I didn't do anything. It's just being dramatic, punishing me because I asked her to move out." "You called her a burden?" Jacob snapped. "In public. On her birthday." Vanessa flinched, but her pride was a wall too thick to crumble that fast. "She was a burden," she muttered. But even as the words left her lips, they felt brittle. It's like dead leaves. Across town, Margaret stood. In the lobby of her new condominium, a modern glass tower overlooking the city skyline. Her luggage wheeled beside her and her chin held high. The concierge greeted her like royalty. Her penthouse had been prepared. Her groceries delivered. Her fridge stocked with organic teas and imported marmalade. She stepped into the elevator alone, watching the floors tick upward until she reached the top. The unit was stunning floor-to-ceiling windows, soft cream furnishings, an art studio on one side, and a writing nook with a view of the harbor. She walked slowly through each room, marveling not at the opulence but at the absence of noise. No tension, no forced gratitude, no waiting for a daughter to remember her. Just peace. She placed a single photograph on the entryway table, one of Lily at age 8, curled up in Margaret's lap, reading a book. The only soul she still cared to protect. Everything else was done. Over the next week, the fallout consumed Vanessa's life like wildfire. Her social media presence, once a constant feed of glamorized motherhood and boutique launches, dried up overnight. She made vague posts about family betrayal and unexpected transitions. But the silence from her followers grew louder than any sympathy. Clients stopped calling. Bills piled up. Jacob, once her enabler, began sleeping on the couch and hinting at separation. The boutique closed temporarily, with a sign that read, "Under management review." Behind the scenes, Yasmin was preparing to relaunch it under a new name. Meanwhile, Margaret spent her mornings walking through the park, journaling and reconnecting with old friends she hadn't seen in years. She began painting again. She even took a yoga class for seniors where she met a widow named Claire who invited her to a monthly book club. Margaret said yes. She was learning to say yes again, but only to herself. And while she never gloated, never posted, never broadcasted her actions, the satisfaction in her chest was deep and nourishing. One evening, about 10 days after the dinner that changed everything, her concierge handed her a small envelope handwritten. No return address. She knew the handwriting instantly. Inside was a note, short and almost desperate. "Mom, I don't know what you're trying to prove. You're being cruel. We took care of you for years. Could have at least talked to me? Instead of pulling the rug out from under us, please. Let's just sit down and talk." Vanessa Margaret folded the letter slowly and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't respond. Some apologies came not from remorse, but from fear of consequences. And she was no longer interested in managing Vanessa's emotions. She'd done that for decades. Her peace was not up for negotiation. Margaret didn't know if Vanessa would ever truly understand the damage she had caused, not just in that one dinner, but in every casual dismissal, every rolled eye, every moment she made her mother feel invisible. But that no longer mattered. Margaret had reclaimed herself. And from the top floor of her new life, she finally saw the horizon clearly, not as a place she was left behind, but as something she was now free to walk toward. The days that followed Margaret's quiet withdrawal from Vanessa's life unfolded like a slow-burning storm, silent at first, then inevitable in its reckoning. Vanessa's calls came in waves, starting with short, entitled voicemails demanding explanations, then shifting to pleading messages soaked in desperation. "Mom, you can't do this to us," one said. "You've always been the backbone of this family. Why are you tearing it apart?" But Margaret didn't reply, not out of malice, but because she had already spent decades trying to explain herself to a daughter who had never cared to listen. The concierge at the condominium had strict orders: no uninvited guests past the front desk. Vanessa showed up twice anyway, the first time with fury in her voice, accusing the building staff of discrimination. The second time with tears in her eyes, holding a store-bought bouquet and speaking Margaret's name as if it still held power over her mother's heart. Margaret didn't come down either time. She simply watched from her balcony, unseen, unmoved, her gaze distant but resolved. She wasn't cruel, she was done. For the first time in her life, she chose herself. It was Lily who finally broke the silence. Her knock gentle, her voice cracking through the intercom with a soft, "Grandma, it's me." Margaret opened the door and saw the 16-year-old. Standing there in jeans and a sweatshirt, eyes glassy but face open with remorse and confusion. She looked more like the little girl who once asked Margaret to braid her hair than the teenager Vanessa had tried to mold into her own image. Margaret stepped aside without a word, letting Lily in. And the two sat together on the ivory couch near the picture window, the silence between them warm, not tense. "I didn't know," Lily whispered after a while, "about any of it. Just knew something felt wrong all the time, but I thought maybe it was just me." Margaret reached over and took her hand, weathered fingers wrapping around youthful ones with love that hadn't dimmed. "It wasn't just you," she said softly. "But you're not to blame for any of it. You're not your mother." Elise. Eyes welled up, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. "She's falling apart," she said. "The boutique's closed. Dad left last week. He said something about debt and bankruptcy and how she ruined the only golden goose they had. I didn't understand what he meant until I heard them arguing. He said it was you, that you pulled everything away. Is that true?" Margaret took a long breath and nodded. "Yes," she said. "But I didn't take anything from her that was truly hers. I only reclaimed what was mine and stopped giving what I was never obligated to give." Lily leaned her head against Margaret's shoulder. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because love without respect," Margaret said, "rots. And I won't rot so someone else can grow entitled." The truth settled between them like a soft quilt. Margaret made no effort to disguise her actions or dull the edges for Lily's sake. She spoke gently but plainly of the title deeds Vanessa never cared to ask about, the business accounts she had propped up in silence, the trust funds she had shifted to protect Lily from the same greed that had poisoned her mother. And Lily, to her credit, didn't recoil or cry harder. She simply listened with wide eyes and a maturity that had likely been forged from growing up in a house that measured value in usefulness, not kindness. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met." Margaret smiled then, the first full smile in weeks. She hugged her granddaughter and felt in that moment that maybe all was not lost, while Margaret rebuilt her days with freedom and joy, visiting the farmers market on Saturdays, painting seafoam blues and twilight purples in her studio, exchanging letters with Lily. Vanessa's world crumbled piece by piece. Without Margaret's anonymous financial backing, the boutique defaulted on its lease. Yasmin, now the new face of the rebranded space, had removed all traces of Vanessa's styling and replaced them with minimalist design and substance. Reviews that once complimented the boutique for luxury tastes with warmth now credited the new owner's grounded vision and ethical practices. Vanessa tried to sue, but the paperwork traced all authority back to Margaret and the holding firm. leaving her with nothing to stand on but pride, which dissolved quickly in court. Her friends, those polished socialites who had once tagged her in photos at launch parties and charity galas, began fading from her life like smoke. They stopped replying to texts, ducked her calls, and turned cold when they saw her name in the news attached to phrases like eviction and financial mismanagement. The invitations stopped. The smiles turned plastic. Even those who once envied her began to mutter behind closed doors about how maybe she had never been that special, just lucky enough to have a mother with deep pockets. The house, stripped of Margaret's protections, went into foreclosure 6 months later. Jacob had already moved into a one-bedroom apartment downtown and filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and financial deception. Vanessa, once a woman who strutted with curated elegance, now found herself renting a cramped space above a nail salon where she survived on savings and resentment. Every time she passed a boutique window or saw someone post about their mother, it stung. She tried to play the victim, telling anyone who would listen that her mother had blindsided her, had abandoned her after years of sacrifice. But the story never landed, because everyone could sense the missing pieces. And the truth has a way of whispering itself through silences. Even her therapist, who she visited once out of desperation, simply said, "Perhaps this is a moment not to mourn what you've lost, but to question what you assumed you had." Vanessa never returned for a second session. Margaret, meanwhile, bloomed. She didn't just exist, she thrived. The book club she joined expanded into a writing circle, where she began drafting a memoir, not to publish, but to understand herself better. She took weekend trips to the coast with Claire and another woman named Beatrice, where they drank tea in windy cottages and talked about youth and mistakes and second chances. She stopped waiting for calls that never came. She stopped shrinking herself to fit inside roles that no longer served her. She even began mentoring a young woman from the yoga studio, Leela, 29 and estranged from her own mother, seeking wisdom in quiet voices. "You don't owe anyone your peace," Margaret had told her one morning after class, and Leela had cried right there on the mat, nodding like she'd waited her whole life to hear those words. Then, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after the infamous birthday dinner, Margaret sat by the window with a cup of rosehip tea when Lily arrived unexpectedly, soaked and shivering. Margaret rushed to bring her in, wrap her in towels, warm her with tea and cookies. "I couldn't stay there anymore," Lily said quietly. "She's bitter all the time, angry, distant. She acts like I betrayed her just for visiting you." Margaret listened, heart heavy but unsurprised. "You don't have to explain," she said gently. "You're always welcome here." Lily smiled, tears in her eyes. "I want to live with you. I want to stay until I go to college." "That's okay." Margaret nodded without hesitation. Papers were signed the following week. A judge approved the guardianship based on stability, welfare, and the unspoken truth that sometimes the best parent isn't the one who gave birth, but the one who shows up when it matters. Vanessa received the news in an email she read in the dark, sitting alone at a kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills and takeout containers. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, staring at the screen, finally understanding what she had spent years refusing to see, that her mother had never been a burden. She had been the foundation. And Vanessa had chipped away at it day by day until it crumbled. Beneath her feet, she closed the laptop and sat in silence, the kind that doesn't comfort at convicts, and far above. In a condo filled with light and laughter, Margaret Harper poured 2 cups of tea and called Lily to the table. They sat together, side by side, sharing stories and dreams, no longer weighed down by expectation or obligation, just love. Real, untainted, enduring love. Margaret wasn't just surviving, she was living, fully, finally, and unapologetically. She was no longer a burden. She was the storm that swept the rot away. And she had never felt more free.